countryside on my doorstep and the Dale's less than 10 minutes from me, I don't think twice about seeing a gamekeeper going about his business, nor do I pay much attention if I see him with a shotgun in the crook of their arm, although the sight of a gun is a tad intimidating. The guns, thankfully, are extremely rare and heavily restricted, but in the right hands can be really useful tools. Guns are used in our area primarily for population control of some animals and to prevent inbreeding from larger wild herds, for example stags. In the right hands, they make the horrible job instant and painless as possible. Now, it may be a surprise, but the UK, which has some of the tightest gun controls in the world, does have an active rifle association with a primary view to educate and to teach people how to use them safely and have ranges in which people can practice and hone in on these skills to make the best shot possible. It was created in 1859. With the increased number of weapons coming into the UK following the recent war, many people were unsure of how powerful these new weapons would be. Furthermore, the public were keen to get to grips with these guns to self-arm themselves in case of another attack. In 1860, it was decided that a great meet be held, but to attract people, a grand competition would also be held with prizes for the most accurate shot. The Queen was very pleased and intrigued with the new meet and insisted that she herself would come along to fire the first gun. The place would be Wimbledon Park. It was perfect for the range as it was long and away from people. Of course, with this many number of people, they needed a reliable transport system to get them there. In the 1800s, there was only really one mode of transport they could turn to: the railways. Unfortunately, the current expense of rail travel was enough to deter many volunteers, so Lord Elchco, the first chairman of the National Rifle Association, contacted the railway companies to see if they could help. Almost all of the railway companies were eager to offer a concession rate to anyone heading to the meet. The only exception was the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway. They held a rather large monopoly in the area, so any concession was a blessing. But they refused. The best Lord Elcho could do was have them agree to put up a poster in their station and sponsor a prize. The London, Brighton and South Coast Railway knew that this meeting was going to be huge and chartered special trains throughout the week-long meet. It was standing room only in the carriages, with many talking excitedly about the modifications and improvement they had made to their weapons. But after the event, the railway didn't pay their proposed prize money, and a rivalry between the railway and the NRA began to emerge. This rivalry turned into loathing when in 1868 train delays and a breakdown in communication led to several volunteer corps breaking ranks and starting a riot and general disorder in the station. And later that year, when the NRA wanted to hold a review, the railway, under short notice, took everyone to the wrong place. This caused so much disruption that the review completely collapsed. The Gazette wrote about the affair and scandalised the railway and wrote that they had heard from the top brass that the railway never wished to carry another volunteer if they could help it. The railway was blamed and shamed for both events, and it was possible that the railway took these comments to heart. They knew that moving the volunteers to and from the meetings and reviews was very lucrative, and agreed that they would put their affairs in better order with a review over their fare arrangements. There was still some grumbling, but a new venture would help the volunteers, and in October 1st, 1868, the Tooting, Merton and Wimbledon Railway was born. The new railway was a blessing. It still ran over the LBN SCR railway lines, but it gave the volunteers a direct link to King's Cross and later St Pancras Station, linking the range to the north. The railway served the volunteers well, but it was still a rather long walk from their clubhouses to the ranges. In 1864, the NRA Council attended a rifle meet in the Woolwich Arsenal. The day was miserable and bleak, and it was raining heavily. The ground was saturated and it would have made walking abysmal. Instead, the gentlemen enjoyed a wonderful ride over a tramway. The tramway was horse-drawn and the carriage was a converted coal wagon, but it served them getting to and from the range with considerable ease. It got them thinking, why can't we have a tramway like it? William Gooch, the younger brother of Daniel Gooch and the Great Western Superintendent, had experience with NRA before, having produced tracks for their running targets on the range, and he was only too happy to be approached for the 4 tramway cars that they had ordered. The early designs for the tramway were very basic, but it was also movable too. It was taken up and stored away after every meeting and then relaid as it was needed. The tramway still wasn't without faults, and it was decided that a permanent way be required to help with the issue of derailments. In 1873, the tramway suffered a blow when the War Office was ceasing its supply of horses from the use of the tramway, and the tramway, as a consequence of losing its free motor power, had to loan horses for the use, and also had to increase the fare by a penny, and set some interesting bylaws. But the popularity of the tramway did increase, and it was decided that the cars, which were now outdated, were upgraded and replaced. The new cars would have safety rails and inward-facing seating all around it, and it was notably safer and more in line with modern standards. By the 1870s, there were calls to have a dedicated steam engine power the line rather than horsepower. Merriweather and Sons offered to lend them a steam fire engine and negotiated a trial of an early locomotive. The fire engine didn't interest the NRA, but the locomotive did. The little engine had a vertical boiler and it was a standard gauge, but it could be modified to run on the 3-foot 6-inch track. The NRA loved the little engine, and in 1878 the engine was loaned to them for the next 2 years. It did so well that the line was extended by 150 yards and the engine was eventually purchased from Merriweather. It tootled along for the next 6 years, entertaining people and taking them to and from the ranges. In the late 1880s, the urban sprawl of London had reached Wimbledon, and for safety it was readily accepted that a new range needed to be found away from the populace, less a peppering of the backside. There was a site near Brookwood called Bisley that seemed hopeful. It was well out of the way of any major cities, and it was little in the way of disturbance. The LB and SCR were furious. They'd made a lot of money through this extra traffic and were in no mood to lose their cash cow to another railway. So they persuaded Charles Scotcher, a fellow board member, to do everything in his power to ensure that any site would be on LB and SCR territory. On the 27th of February 1889, the council took a vote on 6 new sites. The chairman concluded that they had had their last meeting at Wimbledon. Next year, they were going to Brookwood. The tramway would have a much more permanent home, and it was decided that the line start at Brookwood Station to the range at Bisley Common. It wasn't a commonly used line, but for the few weeks it was used in the year, it made up for it with sheer numbers. Thousands would travel on the little line, and soon it became quite well established. As it was on a new patch, a new railway would be serving it. The London and South Western Railway were only too keen to take on the responsibility of the tramway and 1.5 miles of track, and they nicknamed it the Bisley Bullet. By now the little engine the NRA had acquired was now not powerful enough to tackle the larger coaches, and sadly, after doing its duty for decades, its last outing was in 1914, before it and its old coaches were scrapped in the 1920s. During the First World War, the railways up and down the country saw the government take control for the first time, and the branch line was no exception. As the line and the range were perfect for training troops, it was extended to several camps in the area. Being in the austerity years, this took considerable time, but the extension was finished in 1917. It was taken over again in World War II, but the line was only extended as far as the Primor camp. After the war, the line fell into the hands of British Railways, but it was clear that the tramway's glory days were over. Passenger numbers were not even a tenth of what they were 2 decades before, and the vast majority of people were travelling to the annual meets in new cars or coachy parties by roads. It was decided that the tramway from Bisley to Brookwood was surplus to requirements, and the decision to close the little mine was made in 1952. On the 19th of July 1952, people gathered from around the area to give a farewell ceremony to the tramway. Guards and signallers planted detonators along the line as a final hurrah. The engine chosen was number 30027, a 044 Class M7, and was decorated for the occasion. The Cambridge University Rifle Association and the Gloucester Marching Band were there to serenade the crowds with mournful music, and riflemen fired blanks over the train as she passed. The line remained closed for several months before a final special was run. This was much more low-key, but as soon as it passed, the cutters moved in and removed the line. There's hardly anything left of the tramway today. The coaches, engines and tracks have long gone, but the bridge abutments where the tramway crossed the canal, I believe, are still standing, and the station building does remain at Bisley. Amazingly, even though the station hasn't seen an engine in decades, there is a carriage nearby. In fact, it's a Scottish Caledonian sleeping carriage, and provides the Lloyd's Gun Club with sleeping accommodation while using the range. The new carriage is actually a replacement for an old British Railway sleeper carriage which was recently scrapped due to finding it unusable and containing asbestos. You can find railway lines in the most unusual of places, but who would have thought a rifle range? The range used railways for other uses as well, but I think that topic deserves a whole new video. For now, I'm glad that the station is preserved and the NRA is ensuring its railway heritage is never forgotten.